In this video lesson, we'll discuss the Whig Party and the presidency of John Tyler. A horde descended upon Washington early in 1841. Clamoring for the spoils of office, newly elected President Harrison was almost hounded to death by Whig spoilsmen. The real leaders of the Whig Party regarded old Tippecanoe as just an impressive figurehead. Daniel Webster as Secretary of State and Henry Clay, the uncrowned king of the Whigs and ablest spokesman of the Senate, would grasp the helm. The aging general was finally forced to rebuke the overzealous Clay and remind him that William Henry Harrison was the President of the United States. Unluckily for Clay and Webster, the new term had barely started. Harrison contracted pneumonia. Wearied by official functions and plagued by office seekers, the old warrior died after only 4 weeks in the White House, after giving the longest inaugural address in history. He had had the shortest presidency. The Tyler Too part of the Whig ticket, hitherto only a rhyme, now claimed the spotlight, as John Tyler became President of the United States. He was a Virginia gentleman of the old school, gracious and kindly, yet stubbornly attached to principle. He had earlier resigned from the Senate, quite unnecessarily, rather than accept distasteful instructions from the Virginia legislature. He had forsaken the Jacksonian Democratic fold for that of the Whigs, largely because he could not stomach Andrew Jackson. Tyler's enemies accused him of being a hidden Democrat, but this charge was only half true. The Whig Party, like the Democratic Party, was a catch-all, and the accidental president belonged to the minority wing, which embraced Jeffersonian states' writers. Tyler had, in fact, been put on the ticket partly to attract the vote of this fringe group. Many of these people were influential Southern gentry. Yet Tyler should have never consented to run. Although the dominant Clay-Webster group had pushed no platform, an alert politician knew what the unpublished platform contained. On virtually every major issue, the Virginian was at odds with the majority of his Whig Party, which was pro-bank, pro-protective tariff, and pro-internal improvements. Tyler, too, rhymed with Tippecanoe, but that was where the harmony ended. After their hard-won, hard-cider victory, the Whigs brought their not-so-secret platform out of Clay's pocket. To the surprise of no one, it outlined a strongly nationalistic program. Financial reform came first. The Whig Congress hastened to pass a law ending the independent treasury system, and President Tyler, disarmingly agreeable, signed it. Clay next drove through Congress a bill for the fiscal bank, which would establish a new Bank of the United States, an institution that Jacksonians had fought before. Tyler's hostility to a centralized bank was notorious, and Clay would have done well to conciliate him, but to the Kentuckian, robbed of the presidency once again, was in for an imperious mood and riding for a fall. When the bill reached the presidential desk, Tyler flatly vetoed it on both practical and constitutional grounds. Striving to pacify Tyler's objections to a fiscal bank, they passed another bill providing for a fiscal corporation, but the president vetoed the offensive substitute. The Democrats had only been saved from a financial monster only by Harrison's death. Whig extremists condemned Tyler as his accidency, and he received letters threatening him. A wave of influenza then sweeping the country was called Tyler Grip. To the delight of Democrats, the stiff-necked Virginian was formally expelled from his party by a caucus of Whig congressmen, and a serious attempt to impeach him was broached in the House of Representatives. His entire cabinet resigned in a body, except Secretary of State Webster, who was in the midst of delicate negotiations with England. The proposed Whig tariff also felt the pressure. Tyler appreciated the necessity of additional revenue to the Treasury, but the Democrat looked with a frosty eye on the majority tariff scheme of the Whigs because it provided for a distribution among the state's revenue from the sale of public lands in the West. Tyler could see no point in squandering federal money when the federal treasury was not overflowing, and he again wielded his veto power. Chastened Clayites redrafted their tariff bill. They chopped out the offensive dollar distribution scheme and pushed down the rates to about the moderately protective level of 1832, roughly 32% on dutiable goods. Tyler had no fondness for a protective tariff, but realizing the need for additional revenue, he reluctantly signed the law of 1842. In subsequent months, the pressure for higher customs duties slackened as the country gradually edged its way out of the Depression. Democrats were very unhappy about the law. Hatred of Great Britain during the 19th century came to a head periodically and had to be lanced by treaty settlement or by war, and the poison had festered ominously by 1842. Anti-British passions were composed by many ingredients. At bottom lay the bitter memories of the two Anglo-American wars. In addition, the pro-British Federalists had died out, eventually yielding to the boisterous Jacksonian Democrats. British travelers, sniffling with aristocratic noses at the crude scene, wrote of American tobacco spitting, slave auctioneering, lynching, eye gouging, and other unsavory features of the rustic republic. But the literary fireworks did not end. British magazines added fuel to the flames when, enlarging on the travel books, they launched sneering attacks on Yankee shortcomings. American journals struck back with "you're another" arguments, thus touching off the Third War with England. Fortunately, this British-American War was fought with paper broadsides, and only ink was spilled. British authors entered the fray, and they were being denied rich royalties by the absence of an American copyright law. Not until 1891 did Congress extend copyright privileges to foreign authors. Sprawling America, with expensive canals to dig and railroads to build, was a borrowing nation in the 19th century. Imperial Britain, with its flowing treasury, was a lending nation. When the Panic of 1837 broke and several states defaulted on their bonds or repudiated them openly, honest Englishmen assailed Yankee trickery. More dangerous troubles came closer to home in 1837, when a short-lived insurrection erupted in Canada. It was supported by such a small minority of Canadians that it never had a chance of success. Hundreds of Americans, hoping to strike a blow for freedom against the hereditary enemy, furnished military supplies and volunteered for armed service. The Washington regime tried to uphold its weak neutrality regulations, but in the case of Texas, it simply could not enforce unpopular laws in the face of popular opposition. A provocative incident on the Canadian frontier brought passions to a boil in 1837. An American steamer called the Caroline was carrying supplies to the insurgents across the swift Niagara River. It was finally attacked on the New York shore by a British force. Lurid American illustrators showed the flaming ship plummeting over the Niagara Falls, but in fact, the craft sank short of the plunge, and only one American was killed. The American illustrators showed it going over the falls, the ship Caroline, in this picture. This unlawful invasion of American soil, a counter-violation of neutrality, had alarmed aftermaths. Washington officials lodged vigorous but ineffective protests. 3 years later, in 1840, the incident was dramatically revived in the state of New York. A Canadian named McLeod, after allegedly boasting in a tavern of his part in the Caroline raid, was arrested and indicted for murder. The London Foreign Office, which regarded the Caroline raiders as members of a sanctioned armed force and not as criminals, made clear that this execution would mean war. Fortunately, McLeod was freed after establishing an alibi, and it must have been airtight, for it was good enough to convince a New York jury. The tension eased, but it snapped taut again in 1841 when British officials in the Bahamas offered asylum to 130 Virginia slaves who had rebelled and captured the American ship Creole. An explosive controversy of the early 1840s involved the Maine boundary disputes as well. The St. Lawrence River is icebound several months of the year. as the British, remembering the War of 1812, well knew. They were determined, as a defensive precaution against the Yankees, to build a road westward from Halifax to Quebec. Halifax is shown here on the map, and Quebec is shown here. But the proposed route ran through disputed territory, claimed also by Maine under the misleading peace treaty of 1783. Lumberjacks from both Maine and Canada entered the disputed no-man's land of the tall-timbered Aroostook River Valley. Ugly fights flared up, and both sides summoned the local militia. This small-scale lumberjack clash, which was dubbed the Aroostook War, threatened war. For the crisis deepened in 1842, the London Foreign Office took an unusual step. It sent to Washington a non-professional diplomat, the conciliatory finance Lord Ashburn. He established relations with Secretary Webster, who had recently been lionized during a visit to Britain. The two statesmen, nerves frayed by protracting negotiations in the head of Washington's summer, agreed to compromise on the Maine boundary. On the basis of a split-the-difference arrangement, the Americans were to retain some 7,000 square miles of the 12,000 square miles of wilderness in dispute. The British got less land, but one desired Halifax-Quebec route, and diplomacy in this case helped patch the relations between the British and the United States. An overlooked bonus sneaked by in the small print of the same treaty. The British, in adjusting the U.S.-Canadian boundary further west, surrendered 6,500 square miles. The area was later found to contain priceless Mesabi iron ore of Minnesota. You can see on the map the areas that were given up by the United States and acquired by the United States through the Webster-Ashburn Treaty Line. We'll talk more about the difficulties between Britain and the United States and the boundary dispute in class.